Gypsy Rose was recently released from prison and within weeks released her memoir titled Released: Conversations on the Eve of Freedom, where she dropped huge bombshells you may have never heard before. One of the biggest revelations was that Gypsy would actually take baths with Dee Dee, up until the day Dee Dee passed away. If you thought Gypsy's relationship with her mother was crazy, it somehow gets crazier than that apparently. Gypsy actually shares how she never thought that this wasn't normal, and in the bath is where her mother would assist Gypsy and help her shave her hair, and when I say hair, yes, I do mean everywhere. And Dee Dee would refer to this as making Gypsy clean. During a recorded interrogation following the arrest, Nicholas Gaujean, who was Gypsy's boyfriend at the time, who I should also mention actually went through the plan alongside her, he, during interrogation, actually said that after he did the unthinkable act to Dee Dee, Gypsy went to the bathroom and shaved her hairs herself. Plus, Gypsy hid in the bathroom the whole time anyways. He slowly and painfully took her mother's life. After Dee Dee was without a pulse, that's when Nick allegedly wanted to do disgusting things to Dee Dee, but Gypsy didn't let him, and instead Nick did these actions to Gypsy, and he claimed it's consensual. Gypsy says it's not. It's a whole big thing. It's also important to mention Gypsy was 23 years old when the attack happened, and her mom would literally bathe with her up until then. Before we move on to the next revelation, I wanted you to know this next one may be sensitive for some viewers, so keep that in mind. In both the docuseries and Gypsy's book, she alleges that her own grandfather would essay both her and her own mother. Gypsy said that her grandfather would essay her mother even when she was an adult, and while Dee Dee was recovering from a car accident, this is when Gypsy said her grandfather would carry Dee Dee into the rooms, and that's when this act allegedly would take place. That's how she found out it was happening. But in the docuseries, her grandfather actually speaks about these allegations. His name's Claude, and he is the father of Dee Dee. He denied ever harming Gypsy Rose or her mother, and instead claimed she was the one that tried to touch him. Okay, Claude said she was the one that was trying to touch me, and I said no, don't do that. Gypsy also shared she hasn't communicated or spoken to him since she was a child. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, these are very serious allegations, so I don't really want to speculate on it too much, but what do you think about the whole Claude versus Gypsy story? Clearly some acknowledgement was made, but I don't really know. I just hope if this is true, then some healing goes on Gypsy's behalf. And as of Claude getting help he needs maybe as well, because even Gypsy said it herself. She wanted to share this story to hopefully prevent anyone else from becoming a victim of his. But I don't want to speculate too much as said, so pitter patter, let's get at her. Now for something a little more light to cover, Gypsy was actually baptized 7 times. Not for any reason though, just because Dee Dee told everyone she was gonna grow up and become a nun. She was raised Roman Catholic in Louisiana, but eventually Dee Dee became non-denominational when they moved to Missouri. Gypsy recounted how she was baptized 5 times before her mother's life was taken, and then another 2 times when she got to the county prison, and then when she got to the correctional center, as she never felt clean. Gypsy even once said she thought she was gonna be a nun one day as well, so she made a little altar in her bedroom and placed little statues that were sold at her Bible gift shop. As a kid, she would align all her stuffed animals and her cat as they would pretend to attend church, as Gypsy led them all in prayer and gave out communion by feeding them crackers and grape juice to all of her stuffies and cats. And then fast forward to 2024, she's not a nun, but she's a so-called influencer and reformed killer, so I mean that took a turn. I mean, nobody could have predicted that happening to their life in 2015 or ever, so alright. Another bombshell revealed in Gypsy's book was that Dee Dee and her would allegedly shoplift by using the wheelchair. This actually I feel like I could have guessed. This feels really predictable, honestly. Just suits the whole narrative. When they were shopping, they would use the wheelchair to knock items off the shelves, and then when they picked them up, they'd simply just under the princess dress. And at the time, Dee Dee told everyone Gypsy was 5 years younger than her real age, and even dressed her in children's clothes. And once they had the items hidden, then they just swapped the barcodes on the expensive stuff with the cheaper ones. In fact, Gypsy can't even recall how many items they stole. She described her mom as a hoarder, and according to her, their bedroom floor had so much piled on it, she needed to carve a pathway for herself from the door to the bed. And what makes this situation unfortunate, as if it wasn't already, was that the community has viewed this mother and daughter as a kind mother-daughter duo, taking care of her sick special needs child, which ultimately caused no one to suspect they were stealing. It also made it easier for the two, as they would go to the self-checkout lane, so no employee was there to notice the low prices for the expensive items. Grab a PS4, put it in as some grapes. That kind of logic. In her book, she talked about how her mother would claim to be a powerful witch, which actually doesn't line up with the non-denominational thing, but okay. Apparently this powerful powerful witch Dee Dee would use spells to punish her own daughter. Dee Dee would continue to tell Gypsy that she saw shapes and shadows as well as heard voices from people who disliked Gypsy. And Gypsy herself said that her mother had suffered from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but it's ultimately unclear what Dee Dee was diagnosed with, if anything at all. So, while Gypsy's in prison, she actually explored her mother's footsteps as she began to look into Wicca, as it felt familiar to her, and she grew up near New Orleans. Back in 2011, Gypsy tried to run from home after meeting a man named Dan at a convention, and when her mom found out and took her home, she tied her to the bed for 2 weeks and even put a voodoo hex on her. According to Gypsy, Dee Dee printed out a picture of Dan and a picture of Gypsy, then she placed the photos in a mason jar alongside a cow tongue and even a little bit of Gypsy's time of the month, if you know what I mean. Dee Dee then took the jar and buried it in the backyard and then told Gypsy she'd never find love or be happy. To this day, Gypsy literally believes that the hex that her mother put on her could be true because every time she gets close to someone, they leave her. But I feel like there's another reason for that. I'm assuming most of you know that Gypsy was isolated for much of her life. Her mother didn't seem to want to let anyone get too close with her daughter because of the risks of her secrets being revealed. As Gypsy grew up, she was homeschooled, at least for a bit, because shortly after, Dee Dee just stopped educating her daughter and it was never really challenged by the authorities. She was friends with a few neighbors' kids, but she wasn't allowed to get too close to them, as Dee Dee always made sure that she was Gypsy's closest support system. So when she was sent to prison, Gypsy actually only had a first grade education. That is actually insane. But in prison, she was actually able to attend school and eventually earned herself the equivalent of a high school diploma. Did you know that Gypsy also had to write a letter to her own mother as an exercise for a mandatory prison class, which discussed the impacts of crimes on victims? She wrote, "With now having the answers I sought to find, I'm able to finally let go of the resentment I had against you and forgive you." She also apologizes for having a part in her passing and wrote about how she doesn't go a single day without thinking about her mom as she carries her regret and remorse for the rest of her life. In another part of the letter, Gypsy also wrote, "I will always love you for bringing me into this world and will remember you with love for the woman I know was a good person behind the mental disorder." And this was because Dee Dee's believed to have also suffered the things she put Gypsy through. Now that Gypsy's been released, she's been using her social media platforms as a way to hopefully spread awareness about what she's been through, to help others in similar situations find an alternative way out than what she did. Did you know Gypsy spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement? And this was after a stranger posted something onto social media, and the prison officials interpreted this post as a signal that Gypsy was planning on escaping. That's when she was moved to solitary confinement while they investigated. Gypsy has called this time traumatizing, and it didn't make sense to her. This also happened just a few months before her parole hearing. When you're in solitary confinement, you're like physically isolated from basically everyone. On average, you spend 22 to 24 hours a day in your cell. In 2015, the United Nations actually adapted a rule to prohibit placements in solitary confinement beyond 15 straight days, which is already way too much. There are numerous studies done that documented the harmful psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement, which even included visual and auditory hallucinations. So as the story of Gypsy Rose unfolded, more and more secrets were finally exposed, and that included Gypsy's fake illnesses. Since Gypsy was a few months old, Dee Dee started to tell her father Rod that Gypsy had multiple illnesses, and this only escalated as time went on. Gypsy was known for being a strong child who battled a ton of illnesses. Physically, she looked like a child battling cancer, as Dee Dee had shaved her head. She was also in a wheelchair, she had a feeding tube, and it would be quite believable to think that Gypsy was truly ill because of it. But Gypsy actually believed she was sick too, and the only thing she knew, she actually didn't need to use her wheelchair. And that's because before doctor appointments, Dee Dee would instruct Gypsy to sit in the wheelchair and not move her legs, and she did what she was told since she was a child, and she knew what would happen if she didn't listen to her mom. Plus, Dee Dee even once applied a numbing gel on the inside of Gypsy's mouth before an appointment to prove to doctors that she was experiencing excessive drooling, and ultimately the doctors went through with a surgical procedure to remove her saliva glands. But it wasn't until after her arrest she found out everything else, including her cancer diagnosis, were all fake. Dee Dee was actually able to lead doctors into believing what she said, and this all escalated after Hurricane Katrina wiped out many medical records, so it's easier to fake Gypsy's past. It's crazy to me that Gypsy lived most of her life believing she was very sick, and it took her being literally arrested for killing her mom to know the truth about her own health. I'm assuming most of you know about her relationship with Nick, as aforementioned, Nicholas Gaujon. The two met online and eventually planned and acted on taking Dee Dee's life. But you know the two continued to date even after they were both sent to prison? While they were in county jail, they would exchange letters by hiding them in the recreation room and also writing love messages on the walls. When they moved to prison, they did break up, but then exchanged letters still. And when When Nick found out she was engaged to Ken, who was her ex before her current husband, Ryan Anderson aka Peter Griffin, he actually accused Gypsy of cheating because they were still married under God's law. So Gypsy replied to this message and told Nick that she had never wanted to get back with him, but she did feel a sense of guilt, which is why she decided to testify on his behalf at the trial. That is where he was sentenced to life without parole, and she accepted a plea deal. Plus, Gypsy sent Nick a closure letter after he was sentenced to life in prison. She felt guilty for him because she believes if he hadn't met her, he wouldn't have done what he did. In fact, Gypsy couldn't get it out of her head that Nick was looking at going to prison for the rest of his life because she didn't even realize she had also faced the same possible fate. According to Gypsy, it just didn't dawn on her that she was in as deep a trouble as he was, which is a little questionable for people like you and I, but we have to remember she only received up to a first grade level of education, had very little knowledge of the court system.
Top 5 times Gypsy Rose Blanchard was the villain. First off, some people believe that Gypsy Rose is fame hungry even though she tries to hide it. The 32-year-old was recently released from prison after 8 years for orchestrating a brutal crime against her mother Dee Dee Blanchard. She now has more than 9 million followers on TikTok. The idolization of Gypsy Rose shouldn't be a total surprise considering the internet loves cult followings of criminals. But Gypsy's story also isn't a simple one. Many people think that she was wrongly imprisoned in the first place. Dee Dee is believed to have suffered from a disorder known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which led her to subject her daughter to years of unnecessary medical treatments. This included using a wheelchair and getting 2 salivary glands removed. Since her release, Gypsy hasn't wasted any time throwing herself into the media circuit. She's gone on The View, given a handful of exclusive interviews, and gained millions of followers on TikTok and Instagram. Popular influencers have also helped boost her platform. There was even a crazy rumor going around that she might win the title of Time's Next Person of the Year. Her attitude and enthusiasm to lean into her stardom have made her a darling of the internet. Fans have been calling her a queen and commending her courage after everything that she's been through. Despite her video updates having the slightly clumsy quality of someone who's never been on the internet, most people have welcomed Gypsy Rose with open arms. She currently has over 9 million followers on TikTok and 8 million on Instagram. YouTubers are begging her to appear on their podcasts, and media outlets are scrabbling over each other to land an interview. But that's not really surprising. Her story has always been incredibly fascinating and stomach-turning at the same time, especially with all those documentaries, articles, and TV adaptations. Gypsy has always been a bit of a sustained internet celebrity, even while she was in prison, so the internet was ready for her when she was finally released. People were rooting for her to succeed because her story was so horrific, and now they get to see what she actually does with her freedom. But the people who say she's become too fame hungry tend to bring up the fact that she is now a millionaire. According to one source, her net worth has reached an estimated $3 million. Now, how does one who spends nearly 9 years in prison with no previous employment experience end up becoming a millionaire upon their release? Well, her financial status is undeniably linked to her unexpected prominence as a public figure. The documentaries and true crime adaptations featuring her have not only contributed to her net worth, but they've also fueled the ongoing public interest in her case. From participating in documentaries that delve into the complexities of her case, to citing book deals that offer readers insights into her life, she has strategically leveraged her unique experiences. All of that contributed to her overall income. Does that mean she's really a bad person? Well, not really. She does need to make a new life for herself after everything that she's been through, and she clearly hopes to start a family soon. That brings us to our next point. She was seen controlling her husband. So a few weeks ago, there was a viral clip that went around on TikTok. During an interview, Gypsy basically told her husband to shut up when he said something that was a little bit embarrassing. Gypsy was talking about what it was like spending all those years in prison and the fact that she has changed a lot over that time period. She jokes around and says, "Oh, I went from 19 to 32 so quick. Geez, I can't believe I got so old." This is when Ryan says, "You never went to school either." Gypsy is clearly very embarrassed by this comment and quietly tells Ryan to shut up. But she says it under her breath while the camera was still rolling and you can see her smiling. After that, her husband looks completely defeated and he puts his head down, refusing to speak. At other points in the interview, you can actually see Gypsy squeezing his arm when she wants him to be quiet. And even though the quality of the video isn't that great, it's pretty clear that she's found a way to stop him talking whenever she wants to. The whole thing seems a bit like a toxic relationship. But not only that, people in the comment section seem to believe that Gypsy Rose is becoming just as controlling as her mother. One person wrote, "Gypsy needs to be in therapy, not doing multiple interviews." And Gypsy is shushing Ryan the same way her mother did to her. She's doing the same nudge that Dee Dee did when she would hold Gypsy's hand. Another person wrote, "Gypsy is manipulative. She learned this from her mom. If they break up, he's going to spill the beans." Now, this is pretty crazy crazy, but not everyone thinks that way. Of course, there were also those people who were defending her in the comments, saying that Ryan deliberately tried to embarrass her by saying that she had never gone to school. Either way, it's obvious that all these tell-all interviews are not the best thing for their relationship. On April 12th of 2019, Gypsy was reported to be engaged to a prison pen pal. Ryan Scott Anderson started writing to her after he watched the HBO documentary Mummy, Dead and Dearest, which tells Gypsy's story. They knew each other for about a year and a half, and Gypsy's family approved of him. In an interview, she later talked about her morning wedding with Ryan, saying it was very small, we didn't have any guests, it was just something for him. In the future, she said they do plan on having a bigger reception, like a redo wedding with all of their family and their friends and the dress and the cake. Quote, our prison wedding was just something to where we could make our vows to each other. Oh, if I had another chance to redo everything, I don't know if I would go back to when I was a child and tell my aunts and uncles that I'm not sick and mummy makes me sick. Gypsy went on to say, no one will ever hear me say I'm glad she's gone or proud of what I did. I regret it every single day. Her decision to have Dee Dee's life ended came after she tried to run away ahead of another needless procedure. She claims that she fled her home only to be tracked down within hours. After years of reflection, self-work and therapy, when talking about Dee Dee, Gypsy says that she just did not deserve that. But that brings us to our next point, the fact that Gypsy initially lied about committing the crime. On June 14th, 2015, sheriff's deputies found Dee Dee Blanchard face down in the bedroom of her house, lying on the bed because of wounds inflicted several days earlier. There was no sign of Gypsy, who, according to Dee Dee, had chronic conditions like leukemia, asthma, muscular dystrophy, and who had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old, apparently due to brain damage. The following day, police found Gypsy Rose in Wisconsin, where she had traveled with her then boyfriend Nicholas Gojon, whom she had met online. Turns out she let him into the home and allegedly gave him duct tape, gloves, and a knife, with the understanding that he would use it to end Dee Dee's life. Nicholas then carried out the crime while she was asleep. The two of them fled together, and Wisconsin police arrested them at Nick's parents' home. This was a few days after Gypsy posted graphic messages from her mum's Facebook page. The disturbing part is some of those posts are still up on Facebook today. It's chilling to see it and read all of the comments of people getting worried for Dee Dee and Gypsy. During Gypsy's interrogation, she acted shocked to hear that her mother had her life ended. She said, I don't know what happened with my mom. Why don't you just tell me? The officer then looks at her and says, you know what happened to your mom, I know that you know. At this point, Gypsy refuses to admit anything, and she says, you think that it was me? Why do you think that it's me? I've always loved my mom. My mom and I are best friends. She continued to maintain her innocence until Nick eventually revealed the truth. During a prison phone call with her dad, she tells him what was being said about her in the news was not true and swears that she really was innocent. Eventually, her and Nick were both formally arrested, and when Gypsy's attorney obtained her medical records from Louisiana, he secured a plea bargain and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As we all know though, she ended up getting out of prison early. Next up, we have the fact that her illnesses were fake. So despite everything everyone was told by Gypsy and her mother, she was not actually sick. Her mother was. Dee Dee had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is a mental disorder where a parent exaggerates, fabricates, or actually induces illness in a person under their care to try and get sympathy or attention. Dee Dee had been making her daughter pass herself off as younger and pretended to be disabled and chronically ill, subjecting her to unnecessary surgery and medication, and controlling her through physical and psychological mistreatment. Gypsy was not aware of this, and when she found out that she could walk and wasn't fully sick, that's when she came up with her plan to end the life of her mother. After the disclosure of how Dee Dee had treated Gypsy, sympathy for Dee Dee as a victim shifted to her daughter as a long-term victim of mistreatment. Gypsy is quoted at Nick's trial in 2018, saying, if it weren't for Nick and how dark he was, I wouldn't have gone through with it. And to this day, she still blames Nick for the whole thing, even though it was technically her idea. Apparently, Nick wanted the crime to be committed in a much more gruesome way. He wanted it to be messy, but Gypsy was headstrong about calling the shots. After all, it was her mother. During the trial, she explained under oath how a tasteless and odorless poison was too hard to find, that arson would be too complicated, and a firearm would be too messy. So she stole a hunting knife from Walmart and mailed Nick more than $1,000 that she stole from Dee Dee. He was to purchase a round-trip bus ticket for himself and a one-way trip for Gypsy to join him back in Wisconsin. The rest of the money was for food and a room at a nearby Days Inn hotel. Now, what's somewhat funny is that Nick got a harsher sentence than Gypsy, even though she was supposedly the mastermind. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And now on to the last point, the fact that Gypsy was keeping in touch with Nick. Gypsy has said that she was still pining over Nick while they were in the county jail. They exchanged letters by hiding them in the recreation room and writing love messages on the wall. Later, when they were both in prison, the former couple exchanged only 2 letters. When Nick found out that she was engaged engaged to another man, he accused her of adultery and said that they were still married under God's law. She replied that she never wanted to get back together with him but still felt a sense of guilt, which is why she testified on his behalf at the trial. So there was still something between them long after the actual crime had been committed, which is a secret that Gypsy seemed to be hiding from the world.